3 days after the armored car carrying Cassian Thorne broke through a bridge railing and vanished beneath the black water of the Chesapeake Bay on a night of pouring rain, the entire underworld of the East Coast had quietly accepted that the Frost King was gone. Federal divers withdrew after 3 long days of sweeping the bay floor without finding a body. The police closed the file with a few cold words: accident, missing, presumed dead. And on that very third night, behind drawn velvet curtains, rival families were already seated around banquet tables, dividing up his docks, his shipping routes, his streets, carving up a man that only a week earlier, not one of them had dared to look in the eye. Only one person refused to believe it. Delaney Mercer, the poor housemaid, the entire Thorne estate, treated like a shadow holding a dust cloth, stood alone in the master's empty study. Her palm closed around an old pocket watch left forgotten on the desk, his late father's watch, the one keepsake Cassian Thorne had never once been without, in all her years working under that roof. A man who never hurried, who never overlooked even the smallest detail, so what, on that night, had been powerful enough to make him leave behind his father's soul and drive into the storm. The answer, she understood, would not be found in any file the police had already stamped shut. But no one listens to a housemaid. The old head of security waved her off the way a man shoos a sparrow out of his parlor, and the distinguished advisor, now settling into her employer's chair, simply smiled at her, a smile so gentle it sent a chill crawling down her spine. They had all forgotten one thing: the invisible carry a weapon no one ever guards against. They see everything, because no one bothers to notice that they are watching. And when Delaney followed a streak of red mud that did not belong in that house, and a half-burned corner of a map someone had hastily thrown into the fireplace, she touched a truth colder than the bay in the dead of winter. Cassian Thorne was alive. He was wounded, hiding in a forgotten ruin no one would think to search, waiting to die in silence, because the man who once held the entire East Coast in his hand no longer knew a single soul he could trust, because the one who sent him to the bottom of the bay that night was now sitting in his chair, reading his eulogy in a mournful voice rehearsed carefully in front of a mirror. And that man would do anything to make sure the dead never came home. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel, then stay with us until the very last moment of this story. 1 week before the storm that swallowed him, Delaney had watched Cassian Thorne end a man's career with a folded napkin. It was a Tuesday dinner at the estate, and she had been assigned to the service corner of the long dining room, refilling water glasses and staying invisible the way she had learned to do. A dock manager named Wexler had been summoned to the table, a heavy-set man with nervous hands, who ran the northern piers, and who, according to the whispers that drifted through the servants' quarters like smoke, had been skimming from the shipments for the better part of a year. He arrived sweating through an expensive shirt, talking too fast, explaining numbers before anyone had asked him to explain anything. Cassian did not interrupt him. He ate slowly, listened with the patience of a man who already knew every answer, and let the silence stretch until Wexler's voice simply ran out of road. Then Cassian set down his fork, lifted the white napkin from his lap, and folded it once, twice, into a perfect flat square, pressing the crease with his thumb as though the napkin were the only thing in the room that mattered. He placed it beside his plate, looked up with those gray eyes that never seemed to warm, and spoke in a voice so quiet that Delaney, standing 30 feet away, had to hold her breath to hear it. He said that a man who steals from the hand that feeds him has already chosen his ending, and the only kindness left was letting him choose the door he walked through. That was all. No raised voice, no threat spoken aloud. Wexler went gray as ash, and his hand shook so badly he could barely grip the pen when the transfer papers appeared at his elbow. Papers that had been prepared before he ever sat down, because Cassian Thorne never entered a room without already knowing how he would leave it. By morning the man was gone from the city, his house emptied, his name never spoken at that table again. Delaney had stood in her corner with a water pitcher going warm in her hands, and she had understood something that frightened her more than shouting ever could. Real power did not need volume. Real power folded its napkin, spoke once, and the world rearranged itself. That was the man she remembered now, standing in the cold study with his father's pocket watch pressing its shape into her palm. A man who moved through life the way winter moves through a forest, slowly, deliberately, freezing everything into its proper place, which was exactly why the story they were all telling about that final night refused to sit still in her mind. She had been awake when it happened. The staff quarters sat above the garage, and she had heard the phone ring somewhere in the great house well past midnight. heard the sudden urgency of footsteps on marble, heard the master's voice clipped and hard through the walls in a way she had never heard it before. One of the kitchen girls said later that a warehouse down at the harbor had caught fire, that the whole eastern storage block was burning, that Mr. Thorne had taken the call himself and left within minutes. No driver briefed in advance, no route planned, just the armored car roaring out through the gates into a rain that was coming down like the sky had torn open. A man who never hurried had hurried. A man who never overlooked the smallest detail had left his father's watch lying on the desk beside an unfinished glass of water. At the time, she had thought nothing of it, because fires do not wait, and even kings must run when their kingdom burns. But grief has a way of sharpening memory, and in the 3 days since the bay took him, Delaney had turned that night over and over in her mind, the way her mother used to turn a coin between her fingers when the bills came due. And on the third evening, walking back from the market along the harbor road with the wind pulling at her coat, she had stopped at the chain-link fence and looked out at the eastern storage block. Really looked at it, for the first time. The warehouse stood exactly as it had always stood. Its walls were unmarked. Its roof was whole. Its loading doors were the same faded green they had been every morning. She had passed them on her way to the estate. There were no scorch marks, no boarded windows, no smell of old smoke clinging to the salt air, none of the wounds a fire leaves behind long after the flames are gone. She stood there in the fading light, with her fingers hooked through the cold wire, and the truth settled over her shoulders like a wet coat. There had been no fire. The call that pulled Cassian Thorne out of his home, off his own schedule, onto a road someone else had chosen for him in the middle of a downpour, had been built out of nothing. Someone inside that house had lied to him, and the lie had been waiting on the bridge. The estate began wearing its mourning the way an actor wears a costume, and Delaney noticed the seams. Black drapery appeared over the tall windows of the great hall within a single afternoon. Ordered, she learned from the housekeeper, before the police had even finished their final statement, as though someone had known exactly when Hope would be declared officially dead. Preston Vane moved through those darkened rooms like a man who had rehearsed the part of the grieving friend until every gesture sat perfectly on him. He touched the backs of chairs as he passed them. He paused before the portrait of Cassian's late father, with his head bowed at an angle that photographed well. And when the family attorneys and the senior men of the organization gathered in the library, Delaney, carrying in the coffee service, heard him speak of loss in a voice that trembled at precisely the right moments, a voice that cracked on the same words each time he told the story to a new arrival, the same pause, the same catch of breath, the same slow removal of his gold-rimmed glasses to press 2 fingers against his eyes. Grief, she knew from burying her own mother, did not repeat itself so cleanly. Grief stumbled. This performance never missed a mark. In between the condolences, quieter things were happening. She overheard fragments while polishing the corridor brass. Words like transfer of authority and emergency succession and signatures required, and she watched men she had never seen before arrive with briefcases and leave without them. The housekeeper whispered that accounts were being moved for safekeeping, that Mr. Vane was protecting the family's interests during a fragile time, and that a formal ceremony would seal the succession within the week, with representatives of the other families invited to witness it. Everything was being wrapped in the language of duty, but Delaney had spent her whole life watching powerful people from the corners of rooms, and she knew the difference between a man guarding a house and a man measuring it for new furniture. It was on the second morning of the morning that she saw the Boots, Vane's personal security detail, men who answered to him alone and had never mixed with the estate's regular guards, came in through the rear entrance after being gone through the night, and one of them left a trail of drying earth across the service hallway floor she had just finished mopping. She knelt with her rag, and she stopped. The mud was a deep rust color, heavy with clay, threaded with fibers of marsh grass, and she knew it at once, because she had grown up on the poor side of the harbor, where that same stubborn red clay stained every childhood shoe she had ever owned. It came from one place only, the southern marshland below the old shipyards, a drowned and forgotten stretch of country that no security patrol had any business visiting, miles from the bridge, miles from the bay crossing where the whole world insisted their employer had gone down. She cleaned the floor slowly, memorizing the tread pattern of those boots, and carried the knowledge around all day like a hot coal held against her ribs. By evening, she could not hold it alone anymore. She found Buck Odell, the old head of estate security, in his small office by the gatehouse, a gray, bristled man with a face like weathered rope, who had been guarding Thorne property since before Cassian ever ran it. She told him carefully, quietly, that Vane's men were coming back covered in southern marsh clay, that the marsh was nowhere near where the car went down, and that maybe, just maybe, somebody ought to ask why. Buck looked at her for a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup, and then he sighed the sigh of a tired man being handed one more thing he did not want. He told her the divers were federal, the investigation was closed, and the last thing this grieving house needed was a cleaning girl playing detective with mud stains. He said she should stick to her floors and let serious matters rest with serious people. And he waved her toward the door with the weary patience of a man brushing a moth away from a lamp. It stung her. Walking back across the dark courtyard, it stung worse than she expected. But what Delaney could not have known that night was that the old man's dismissal was the very thing that saved her life. Because Buck Odell considered the conversation so far beneath notice that he never wrote it in the security log, never mentioned it in the morning briefing, never passed a single word of it up the chain to the man now running the house. In the ledgers of the estate, in the mind of Preston Vane, the housemaid did not exist, and so no one thought to watch her. That night, passing the library on her final rounds with her arms full of folded linens, she slowed at the half-open door. The room was empty, except for one man. Preston Vane stood before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, utterly still, staring down into the low orange embers where, 3 nights earlier, a scrap of burned map had curled at the edge of the grate. He was not warming himself. He was watching the fire finish a job, and the fire, Delaney realized with her heart climbing into her throat, had not quite finished it. The next morning, Delaney stood in the housekeeper's office, with her eyes lowered and her hands folded, and she lied for the first time in her adult life. A death in the family, she said. An aunt down the coast. A funeral that could not wait. The housekeeper, distracted by florists and seating charts for the succession ceremony, granted her 3 days without looking up from the lists. And so, while the great house busied itself preparing to crown a new king, the housemaid rode the early bus to the end of its route, stepped off alone at a cracked and weedy turnaround, and began walking south, in the one direction that every official map, every police report, every television reporter had already agreed held nothing at all. The southern marshland opened before her like a country the world had deliberately misplaced. Rusted channel markers leaned out of still water. Dead pilings marched in broken rows toward a horizon the color of old nickel. The air smelled of salt and diesel and rot, and the only sounds were her own boots sucking at the red clay and the distant complaint of gulls. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. She only knew what Buck and the divers, and all the serious people had never bothered to consider. Something every child raised poor along that harbor learned before they learned their letters, that the bay did not keep what it caught. The tide in that water ran hard to the south when it emptied, hard enough to drag crab traps off their lines, hard enough to carry lost things through the channels and lay them down among the reeds where nobody with a badge or a boat ever thought to look. If the water had taken a man off that bridge, and the man had lived long enough to fight it, the water would not have left him in the deep. It would have carried him here, to a place where no one on earth imagined the current could deliver a human being. She walked the edge of the first channel for what felt like hours, and the marsh began to speak to her in small, terrible confessions. A sheen of oil lay trapped in a pocket of still water between the reeds, spreading its dull rainbow where no boat had passed in years. Farther on, wedged deep in the gnarled roots at the waterline, she found a twisted plate of metal painted a flat armored black, its edge torn like paper, and she stood over it with her hand pressed to her mouth, because she had washed the car that color 100 times in the estate garage. She made herself keep walking. The trail of the current led her along a collapsing fence line, where the marsh gave way to the old industrial shore, and there, snagged on a spur of rusted wire at the height of a man's shoulder, a strip of dark fabric moved gently in the wind. Fine wool, suit cloth, stiffened along one edge with a stain gone the color of dried rust. She freed it with shaking fingers and held it in her palm the way she had held the pocket watch. And she understood that she was no longer following a theory. She was following a man. He had come out of that water alive. Hurt, but alive, and moving. Beyond the fence, the ground firmed into cinder and gravel, and that was where she found the footprints, preserved in a stretch of clay soft from the rains. One print pressed deep and true, the other dragged, shallow and smeared, the toe carving a long furrow before each step landed. Deep and shallow, deep and shallow. A man walking on a wound, hauling one side of his body forward by pure refusal, again and again, in a line that did not wander and did not rest. She raised her eyes and followed the direction of that broken rhythm, and there against the pewter sky stood the carcass of the old shipyard, a dead cathedral of cranes and corrugated iron that had built its last hull before she was born. The prince led toward it the way a sentence leads toward its final word. She crossed the yard in the failing afternoon light, past chained gates long ago pried open, past workshops gutted to their ribs, following the drag and stamp of those prints across concrete dusted with rust, down a sloping ramp into the great dry dock, where the shadows pooled thick and cold. And there, set low into the wall beneath the overhang, she saw it. A steel tool locker, half sunk into the dock wall. Its heavy door not shut, not open, but resting a hand's width ajar, held from inside. She stopped. The whole ruined yard held its breath around her, and through that narrow gap in the darkness, faint as cloth moving over stone, ragged as a saw drawn slow through green wood, came the unmistakable sound of a man breathing. She said his name once, softly, into the gap of darkness, and the breathing stopped. Delaney pulled the heavy door wider on its groaning hinge, and the last gray light of the afternoon fell into the locker and found him. Cassian Thorne sat wedged against the back wall among coils of cable and shelves of forgotten tools, his knees drawn up, his suit ruined to rags, 3 days of shadow on a face burned dry with fever. His eyes were closed, his lips were cracked, his skin had the waxed and hollow look of a man whose body had begun spending its final reserves. And still, before she had taken one full step toward him, before his eyes had even opened, his hand shot out of the dark and closed around her wrist with a strength that did not belong to a dying man, a grip that came from somewhere deeper than muscle, from the same place that had kept him breathing in a steel box for 3 days. When his eyes finally opened, they were glassy with fever, but there was nothing soft in them, nothing grateful, nothing rescued. They moved over her face, her coat, her empty hands, the doorway behind her, cataloging everything with the cold arithmetic she had watched across a dinner table 1 week and a lifetime ago. And the first words he spoke, in a voice scraped down to gravel, were not "Who are you?" They were "Who sent you?" She held very still, the way you hold still near an injured animal, and told him the truth in a steady voice, that nobody sent her, that she cleaned his house, that she had seen the watch he left behind, and the mud his trusted men were tracking home from this marsh, and that she had followed the tide because nobody else on earth was coming. Something flickered behind the fever then, some engine turning over in the dark, weighing her, testing the story against everything he knew about how people lie. His grip did not loosen. "If you called that house," he said, "if you so much as touched a phone that answers to that roof, then neither one of us sees morning." He said it without drama, the way a man states the weather, and that frightened her more than shouting would have. She told him she had called no one, that no living soul knew where she stood, and after a long moment his hand released her wrist. Not in trust, she understood, but in triage, because he had measured his own failing strength and decided she was the lesser danger. Then she saw the shoulder. He had cut his shirt away from it days ago, and in the weak light she made out the wound and what he had done to it, and her breath left her. Beside him on the floor lay an old canvas tool roll, cracked open, and in it a sailmaker's needle gone orange with rust and a length of waxed thread meant for mending canvas. And with those, alone, in the dark, with his opposite hand shaking, the man had closed his own wound stitch by crooked stitch, rather than allow himself to bleed into sleep. The sight of it told her everything the newspapers never had. This was not a man who had been waiting to die. This was a man who had been refusing to, hour after hour, with rusted steel and thread, holding the door of his own life shut by hand. But the wound had gone bad. She could see the angry heat of it from a foot away, and the fever riding him was the marsh collecting its rent. She knelt and opened her bag, and the training she had abandoned years ago came back to her hands before it came back to her mind. She talked to him quietly the whole time, the way the nurses on her mother's ward used to talk, telling him each thing before she did it. And she cleaned the wound properly, eased out his desperate stitching, and closed it again with the small, neat rhythm she had practiced long ago on hospital linens. Her hands sure, her hands steady, her hands the only calm thing in that steel room. He watched those hands the entire time. He never once looked away, and he never once made a sound, though the pain must have been a white country he was walking through alone. She wet a cloth and laid it against his burning forehead. She raised a bottle of water to his mouth and rationed it into him one slow sip at a time, telling him more would make him sick, and he obeyed her, this man who had never obeyed anyone, because some animal part of him recognized that in this one small kingdom of wounds and water, she outranked him. Somewhere in the middle of it, the fever pulled him under again, and he fought it, surfacing over and over to fix her with that interrogating stare, as if sleep itself were a stranger whose intentions he did not trust. The last time he surfaced, with the dark coming down outside and the wind off the marsh keening through the dead cranes, he looked at her for a long moment and asked her, quieter this time, almost to himself, why a woman who owed him nothing would walk into a grave to pull a stranger out of it. She did not answer. Not yet. She only wrung the cloth and laid it cool against his skin. And in the darkness of that steel room, the most feared man on the East Coast closed his eyes at last and let a housemaid stand guard over his life. By morning, the fever had loosened its grip enough for the cold arithmetic to return, and the first thing Cassian Thorne did with his renewed strength was try to buy her. He was propped against the locker wall in the thin dawn light coming through the door she had wedged, and he studied her as she changed the dressing. And then he began, in that quiet voice that had emptied a dock manager's life across a dinner table, to name a figure. He told her there was an account his enemies had never found, that a person of ordinary appetites could live 3 lifetimes on what he was offering, that all she had to do was walk out of the marsh, forget the shape of his face, and be silent until the silence made her rich. He was still building the number, stacking zeros the way other men stack sandbags, when she cut him off with a shake of her head. She said she had not waded through a drowned country to collect a fee from a crime boss, and she was not interested in what his silence market paid. She said she came because somewhere in the world there was a man everyone had agreed to bury while his heart was still beating, and she happened to be the only person alive who disagreed. Then she went on rapping his shoulder, as if the largest bribe of her life had been a remark about the weather. Cassian watched her work in silence for a long moment, and something in his face rearranged itself, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way an instrument adjusts to a reading it did not expect and cannot dismiss. Money was the only language his world had ever spoken to him, and this small, tired woman had just answered him in a tongue he did not know. So instead of offering again, he did something rarer. He began to talk. He told it in fragments, the way men tell things they have been alone with too long, beginning from the moment the armored car pulled out of the gates into the rain. The driver, he said, a man who had held that wheel for 8 years, had taken the coast route without being told, a deviation Cassian had noticed and questioned, and the answer had come back, smooth and reasonable. Roadwork on the usual crossing, a detour called in. Then the small wrongnesses began arriving one after another like guests to a party he had not thrown. The door locks cycling shut on their own, the window controls going dead under his hand, the privacy divider rising between him and the front seat without his order, and through it, dimly, the driver's shoulders sitting rigid as a man's who is either committing a sin or witnessing one. The car had been sealed around him by its own systems, he said, turned from a fortress into a casket by someone who understood its wiring better than its passenger did. What saved him was a thing almost no one living knew existed, a floor hatch his father had ordered welded into the chassis decades ago, back when the old man trusted engineers more than bodyguards. Cassian had gone through it into the roaring dark while the car was still moving, and the water had taken him the instant he dropped, and from somewhere above and behind came the flat cracking of gunfire chasing him across the surface as the current dragged him under the pilings and away into the black. He did not remember reaching the marsh. He remembered cold, and reeds, and crawling, and then the locker, and the needle, and the arithmetic of staying alive 1 hour at a time. When he finished, the steel room was very quiet, and Delaney watched him lay the ambush out in his mind, like a hand of cards face up, examining each of Preston Vane's moves, the false urgency, the borrowed route, the sealed car, the waiting guns, nodding slowly at each one as though grading the work of a student he had trained himself. And then, at the last card, he stopped. She saw it happen, saw his gaze go fixed and inward, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The route, he said, the coast route at night, in rain, the one stretch where a heavy car meets a low railing over deep water with no shoulder and no witnesses. Vane was a man of ledgers and lawyers, patient, greedy, capable of the wiring and the money and the lie. But the choosing of that road, the reading of his habits, the knowledge of which detour he would accept without suspicion because it echoed his own preferences, that was intimacy, not accounting. That decision had been made by someone who had ridden in that car. The words settled over them both like a colder draft through the door, and neither of them said the obvious aloud, that the circle of such people was very small, and that Delaney was about to walk back inside it, because that was the shape their pact took as the light strengthened. No contract, no payment, only necessity. He needed proof before he could rise from the dead, since in his world a king who returns empty-handed is only a target standing up. She needed nothing he understood yet, and she was the one creature on earth his enemies would never think to watch, the woman who carried linens past open doors, invisible in plain sight. He was still teaching her which rooms held which secrets, when she raised her hand suddenly for silence, and they both heard it then, thin and far away across the water, carried on the morning wind through the dead cranes, the sound of dogs. The dogs were still only a rumor on the wind when Cassian began to speak, and what he said was not a warning but a forecast. He sat very still, with his eyes half closed, and he told her what was happening in rooms neither of them could see. Told it in the flat, certain voice of a man reading tomorrow's newspaper aloud. He will move the ceremony up, Cassian said. Grief has a calendar, and he is running ahead of it, which means something has spooked him, which means his men found nothing in their first pass through this marsh, and the nothing is eating him alive. He searched once already, quietly, in the dark, because his own story chains his hands. The world believes I am at the bottom of the bay. He cannot drag lakes and post rewards for a man he has already buried on paper, so he must hunt me the way a thief hunts, without lights, without questions, without help. And a thief who finds nothing twice does not search a third time. He burns. Delaney listened, and the hair rose on her arms, because there was no fear in the telling, only the terrible familiarity of a craftsman recognizing his own workmanship. You want to know what a traitor will do next? Cassian said, watching the gray light strengthen in the doorway. Then remember what you taught him. I taught Preston Vane that a problem you cannot solve is a problem you erase. I taught him that patience wins wars, but speed wins coups. I taught him never to leave a loose thread near an open flame. He learned it all at my table, and now he will serve it back to me course by course. And that is his weakness, because a man who fights with borrowed knowledge can be read like a borrowed book. And in the great house across the water, in those same hours, Preston Vane proved him right sentence by sentence. He gathered the senior men in the library before the morning fog had lifted, and told them, with his voice trembling at the well-rehearsed places, that instability was blood in the water, that the other families smelled it, and that for the good of everything the late Mr. Thorne had built, the succession could not wait for sentiment. The emergency accord was moved up. Objections were met with the gentle reminder of who now controlled the accounts, that paid every man in the room. Papers traveled. Witnesses were confirmed. And when the library emptied, Vane stood alone at the tall window with his gold-rimmed glasses in his hand, looking south toward a smudge of marsh on the horizon, and gave one quiet order into his phone to the men who answered to him alone. Go back through the southern flats, he said. Every structure, every hull, every hole. And this time bring the fuel. Whatever will burn, burn. Whatever floats, sink. I want that shoreline clean by tomorrow night. In the shipyard, Cassian was already moving, because he had scheduled his enemy's order before his enemy gave it. He will come with fire this time, Cassian told her as she packed the dressings and the water. And he will come wider and slower, which buys us the head start his impatience just spent. The locker had kept him alive precisely because it sat in the one blind fold of the dry dock that eyes passing above would never think to search. But a blind spot only works against men who are looking, he said, not against men who are burning. And so the shelter that had saved him for 3 days was finished, and the marsh that had hidden him was about to become a trap with one exit. He stood, and the standing cost him. She could see the price of it cross his face, and get paid without a sound. And then he took stock of her, of the bag, of the light, like a general inspecting the entire army he had left. There was an old keeper's station on the point beyond the northern channel, he told her, a lighthouse dead longer than the shipyard, off every patrol map because it belonged to no one and led to nowhere, and nowhere was presently the only country that would take them. They went out into the last of the darkness, single file, her shoulder under his good arm, following the seam where the cinder ground met the reeds so the clay would keep no record of them, and the ruined cranes stood over there leaving like mourners at the wrong funeral. They had just reached the tree line of dead pines at the yard's northern fence when the night behind them changed. Light swept the marsh, long white blades of it slicing through the mangrove tangle, and the reed banks, headlamps riding high the way they ride on heavy vehicles, and beneath the wind came the sound of engines, not one engine but several, spread wide apart and crawling, the sound of a net being dragged slowly toward the place where they had just been sleeping. The rain came back with the hunters, hard and slanting, and it was the only mercy the night offered. Voices reached them first, then the dogs, closer now, their cries snapping back and forth across the marsh. Through the dead pines, Delaney saw figures fanning out along the shipyard fence, black rain jackets shining under the sweep of the lamps, and on each shoulder, caught for an instant in the light, a stitched emblem she had seen 1,000 times on the estate gates, a silver anchor in a ring. Thorn Security, his own name, hunting him through the reeds. Cassian did not waste 1 second on the bitterness of it. He pulled her down into the grass, and his voice went low and clipped, stripped of everything but instruction. "The dogs first," he said. "Dogs beat men. Kill the scent, we kill half the hunt." He led her back along the fence at a crouch to a gutted machine shop at the yard's edge, and inside, among the rusted hulks, his hands found what his memory had filed away days ago, a drum of old machine oil, its dregs black and rank. He soaked a torn rag, dragged it over their boots, their cuffs, the hems of their coats, then flung the rag one direction and led her the opposite way. "Petroleum sits on the nose like a burn," he said. "They will chase the rag. Move." They moved. Behind them, the dog cries bent eastward, tangled, furious, chasing a lie across the cinders. But the lamps kept coming, spread wide, patient, walking the whole yard in a slow closing crescent, and Cassian angled north through the reeds until the ground softened and a tidal creek opened black in front of them. "In?" he said, against the current. Water tells no stories. The cold clamped her legs like iron. They waded upstream through the running dark, rain hammering the surface into static around them, his arm rigid across her shoulders each time the bottom dropped. And every step erased them. Footprints, scent, warmth, everything, the creek swallowing their trail as fast as they laid it. When the creek bent back toward the lights, he took them up the far bank into the mangrove tangle, and through the roots she saw the beams sweeping the reed banks they had just abandoned. Methodical, unhurried, terribly certain. Then the marsh ran out. The point narrowed ahead into open water, and the only road left standing was the old loading pier, a black skeleton walking out across the channel on rotten legs toward the far shore, and the distant stub of the dead lighthouse. Half its planks were missing. The rest were soft as bread. Cassian looked at it for one breath. "They will not follow us onto that," he said. "They know what it is. So do I. Go light, go fast. Step where I step." He went first. The pier groaned under him like something waking. She followed, matching his boots plank for plank, the channel running black and fast between the gaps under her feet, rain lashing the timbers slick. A board cracked under her heel and dropped away into the dark, and she heard it slap the water below and kept moving, because his hand had already closed on her wrist and hauled her past the hole. Behind them, shouts. The lamps found the pier. Light pinned their backs and threw their shadows long and stumbling across the broken boards ahead. Then the night split. Gunfire, flat and hard, hammering through the rain, and the water off to their left jumped in a stitched line where the shots went in, deliberately wide, deliberately close, a sentence written in the channel for them to read. Not a rescue party's signal, a hunter's warning. Delaney's legs went to water and Cassian's grip did not allow it, dragging her on, low and fast, while the pier shuddered and complained and shed pieces of itself into the current behind them. At the tideline of the far shore, they dropped off the last sagging span into wet gravel, and she looked back once. The hunters stood clustered at the pier's landward end, lamps crowding the first rotten planks, and not one boot tested them. The channel lay between like a drawn blade. Voices carried thinly over the water, argument, frustration, and then the beams swung away to search for a crossing that did not exist. Cassian pulled her up the stones and into the bracken, and they climbed the point in the streaming dark, until the old keeper's station rose against the sky. A blind tower and a low stone cottage crouched at its foot, dead longer than either of their lifetimes. He forced the cottage door with a pry bar from her bag and they fell inside, soaked, shaking, alive. But he did not rest. He went to the seaward window with the old field glasses he had carried out of the locker, and he watched the far shore where the hunt was regrouping, lamps pooling around the vehicles, and Delaney saw his whole body stop, not tense. Stop, as if the fever had returned and frozen him standing. She crossed to him and he handed her the glasses without a word, and she found the figure the lamps were gathering around, the one giving orders with sharp economical gestures, the one the others obeyed, and though the rain smeared the light she knew that build, that stance, that profile behind the wheel of 100 morning departures from the estate gates. The man commanding the hunt was the driver, the man who had driven him onto that bridge and abandoned the wheel before the drop, the man the whole world believed was lying beside his master at the bottom of the bay. The river crossing and the rain collected their price before morning. By the time Delaney had a small fire hidden in the cottage stove, Cassian's shoulder had gone hot as a stove lid himself. The wound angry beneath its dressing despite everything her hands knew, and the fever that the marsh had loaned him, came back to collect with interest. He stopped answering her in sentences. Then he stopped answering her at all. He slid down the wall by the window with the field glasses still in his fist, and she caught his weight and laid him out by the stove, and felt his pulse running fast and thin as a frightened bird's, and she understood with a cold, clear certainty that willpower and clean water had carried him as far as they could, that without real medicine, the strongest man she had ever met would not see another sunset. So she did the arithmetic her mother's hospital years had taught her, weighed his hours against her own risk, and went back out into the rain alone. The harbor clinic sat 3 streets up from the fish piers, a tired little building that patched up deckhands and cannery workers, and Delaney knew it the way only the poor know such places. From the inside, from the waiting rooms, from the years when it was the only medicine she and her mother could afford. She knew the night nurse kept 1 chair and 1 radio in the back office, and did not leave them between rounds. She knew the delivery entrance stuck in wet weather and never latched true. She knew which shelf in the supply room held what she needed, because she had once stared at that shelf through a doorway for a whole evening, while a doctor decided whether her mother's chart justified opening it. None of that knowledge felt like power as she came up the alley with her hood down against the rain. It felt like trespass against her own life. Twice, she flattened into doorways, as vehicles crawled the waterfront street, with searchlights wandering the pilings, black shapes with silver anchors on their doors, hunting a housemaid and a dead man, and twice she made herself breathe until they passed. Then she was through the swollen delivery door into the dark, counting her steps down the corridor she had wept in years ago, past the humming refrigerator, into the supply room, and her hands moved fast and sure among the labeled shelves, taking only what a fevered wound demanded and nothing more. And on the way out she stopped, found the battered donation box by the reception window, and pushed into it every folded bill she had carried out of the estate, her whole savings against her whole conscience, and slipped back out into the rain. The return to the point nearly finished her, but the medicine did not fail. Through the deep hours of that night she fought for him the way the ward nurses had once fought, by inches, by degrees, by the clock she refused to look at, bathing the heat out of his skin with rainwater warmed on the stove, holding his head steady to get the doses into him, packing her own dry coat around him when the shivering came. And somewhere past the middle of the night, in the red half-light of the stove, the Frost King began to talk, not to her, to the Fevers Company. Fragments at first, orders to no one, numbers, a name she did not know, and then, in a voice she had never heard from him, a voice with all the iron gone out of it, low and young and unbearably careful, he said, "Father." He said it twice. He said, "Father, I held it. I held everything, the way you told me." He said, "You can look now." And Delaney sat very still in the dark with her cloth in her hand, understanding that she was hearing the one conversation this man had been carrying unfinished through his entire armored life, the report a son files forever to a listener who is never coming back, and her eyes burned, because she knew that room. She had her own unfinished conversation, addressed to a woman in a hospital bed, and she knew exactly how long the dead keep us waiting for an answer. Then his hand moved, blind, fever-heavy. It dragged across the floorboards searching for something, and before she could reason with herself, her own hand was simply there, and his fingers closed around it and gripped, hard, the way a man grips a rope over deep water. This man who awake would sooner have bled than reached for anyone, and the grip did not slacken. She did not take her hand back. She sat through the remaining dark, with her palm aching in his, and his breathing slowly evening out, the rain washing against the blind tower above them, and she talked to him quietly about nothing, about the harbor, about morning, the way you talk a frightened sleeper back from the edge of a dream. Near dawn the fever finally broke. She felt it leave him, felt his skin cool and his breath deepen, and she was still there, stiff and spent and unmoving, when the gray light found the window and his eyes opened, clear for the first time in days, and looked down at their two joined hands, and he did not let go. That evening, with the hunt combing the far shore and the point wrapped in fog, they sat on opposite sides of the stove's small fire, and the silence between them slowly changed its nature, the way silence does when two people have held hands through a night, and neither will speak of it. He asked her, finally, quietly, the question he had asked at the edge of the fever. Why? Why walk into a grave for a stranger? She watched the fire for a while before she answered. I was going to be a nurse, she said. He waited. The stove ticked. I had the uniform, she said. I had the books. I was near the end of my schooling when my mother's kidneys began to fail, and there was no one else, so I left. Just like that? He asked. She smiled without anything in it. Nothing is just like that, she said. You tell yourself 1 semester. Then you are working from the day you leave the schoolroom behind, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and the hospital becomes your address. I could tell you the sound of every machine on that ward. I slept sitting up in a vinyl chair for so many years that lying flat felt wrong. The fire cracked and settled. And her? He asked. Your mother. Delaney's hands closed around each other. She held on longer than anyone believed she could, she said. She used to say she was staying to see me graduate someday. And then one night I took an extra shift at the laundry, because the bills had teeth that month, and while I was feeding sheets into a press on the other side of the harbor, she stopped waiting. Her voice stayed level, which was somehow worse than breaking. I got there after, she said. The corridor, the nurses, the quiet. You know a room has changed the moment you see the door. I stood there in my work apron, and I understood that the one person who ever waited for me had finally run out of waiting, and I had been 40 minutes of city traffic away. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were dry and terrible. My whole life, no one has ever waited for me, she said. Not once. So I do not leave people behind. That is the whole answer. That is why you are alive. The fire burned. He did not offer her sympathy, and she was grateful, because she would not have survived sympathy. Instead, after a long time, he paid her honesty back in the only currency that meant anything. My father built everything I have, he said, and he built me the same way he built the docks, to specification. She turned to look at him. Love, in that house, was a strategic weakness, he said. Those were his words, spoken like policy. Affection was leverage you handed to your enemies. So we did not have dinners, we had briefings. I can remember whole years of meals where the only sounds were silverware and the tide. Was he cruel? She asked. Cassian considered it with strange care. He was thorough, he said at last. Cruelty would have required him to notice me as a separate thing. She waited, sensing more underneath. The day I took over, he went on, I read his old ledgers, all of them. I wanted to understand the man by his numbers, since I was never offered the man himself, and I found the price of every handshake I had watched him make. Business is business, he used to say, and in those pages I finally saw what business had bought and what it had buried, and I understood that I had been raised not as a son, but as a succession plan. The fire spat a red ember onto the stone and died there. I learned the lesson better than he taught it, Cassian said. I trusted no one. I let no one close enough to cost me. Do you know? He said, and here his voice dropped so low the fire nearly took it. I cannot remember the last time a person touched me whose hands were not shaking. Bodyguards flinch, partners flinch, men I have made rich flinch when they pass me the salt. Fear was the whole weather of my life, and I called it respect. He looked at her hands, folded loose and quiet in the firelight. Yours never shook, he said. Not with the needle, not in the water, not last night. She had no answer, and he did not seem to need one. Later, when the fog pressed white against the window and her body finally called in its debts, she drifted off sitting up in the old keeper's chair, hospital style, out of habit older than grief, and Cassian watched her sleep for a while. Then he rose, stiff and careful, took up what remained of his ruined suit jacket, and laid it over her shoulders, tucking the collar with a gentleness that no living witness would have believed of him, the first thing he had given anyone in years that was not payment, not strategy, not fear. He was turning back toward the fire when the light caught it. On the crate beside her sat the old pocket watch she had carried out of the estate to return to him, his father's watch, and the flame's flicker ran across its worn gold cover, and something in the way the light broke there stopped him. A hairline seam beneath the casing, a shadow under the works, a wrongness in the weight of a thing he had carried his entire adult life. He picked it up slowly, and it ticked against his palm like a small buried heart. He told himself it was maintenance. The watch had gone into the bay with him and come out again, and salt water kills old movement slowly, from the inside. So when Delaney woke near midnight to the small sounds of metal on wood, she found him at the crate, with the fire built up and the watch lying open under his hands like a patient on a table. He had found a jeweler's precision in the keeper's rusted toolbox, thin blades and a bent pick, and he worked with the same unhurried exactness she had watched him bring to everything, easing the case back loose, lifting the works free of their housing to dry them, a ritual his father had performed at that same slow pace on winter evenings long ago. And then his hands stopped. Delaney sat up. In the well of the case, beneath where the movement had rested for as long as he had owned it, hidden in a shallow hollow that the works themselves had covered like a stone over a grave, lay a small flat memory card wrapped tight in yellowed film, sealed there by a careful hand in a place that would never be found by anyone who did not take the entire watch apart. And in 15 years of carrying it against his heart, Cassian Thorne never had. Neither of them spoke. Her battered phone had a slot that fit. It took 3 tries with his hands, which she noticed had begun, very slightly, to shake. The hands that never shook. And then the screen lit the stone cottage blue and the past came up out of the dark. Ledgers. His father's private ledgers, the oldest ones, from years Cassian knew only as legend, photographed page by patient page, and threaded through them, annotated in his father's small iron handwriting. A second story running underneath the first. Payments flagged and questioned. Sums that vanished and resurfaced wearing new names. A pattern his father had been quietly hunting through his own house. And on the final images, clipped together the way a man assembles an accusation he intends to make in person, the pattern acquired a signature. A young man's signature, tilted and eager. On transfer papers, on falsified accounts, on a maintenance order for the elder Thorne's private car, dated 11 days before the crash. That the police of that era had ruled an accident on a rain-slick coast road, pressed in vain. The name repeated down the years like a knock on a door. Delaney read it over his shoulder and felt the cold come up through the floor. The crash that had made Cassian an orphan and a king in the same hour had been bought and built by the smiling man with the gold-rimmed glasses, and the proof of it had ridden in Cassian's breast pocket through 15 years of board meetings where he sat across the table from his father's killer and passed him documents and called him by his first name. His father had found it all. His father had gathered it, sealed it in the one object he knew his son would never surrender, and had been, the date said so, days from acting on it when the road took him. The man who taught that trust was weakness had trusted exactly one person with his suspicions unspoken, his own protégé, the bookkeeper he had raised up from nothing, and it had cost him his life, and the lesson had passed to his son, wrapped around the wrong moral for 15 years. Cassian set the phone down with a steadiness that was its own kind of scream, and then the steadiness ran out. Delaney watched the architecture of him come down quietly. No sound, no words. Just a man folding forward over a gutted watch with his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face. The Frost King, the man a bullet and a drowning, and 3 days in a steel box, had not bent, broken at last by a few grams of plastic and his father's handwriting. His shoulders shook, once, twice, like something enormous, shifting its footing far underground. He was not weeping for the Empire. She understood that, without being told. He was weeping for the silent dinners, for the briefings that should have been suppers, for the man who had built his son into a fortress, because someone in his house was already inside the walls, for every hard lesson that had really been a warning nobody lived to explain. And Delaney did not reach for wisdom, did not tell him it would be all right, did not commit the small violence of words. She simply moved, the way she had moved 100 nights on a hospital ward, and sat down on the floor beside him, close enough that her shoulder rested against his good arm, and stayed, present and silent, keeping the vigil she knew by heart, the one you keep beside someone whose world is ending in a quiet room. The fire burned down. The fog held the windows. How long they sat that way she never afterward knew. But when Cassian finally raised his head, the grief had not left his face so much as changed its state, the way water changes when the cold gets into it. And looking at him across the small light, Delaney felt something in her own chest go still, because the eyes that met hers were no longer the eyes of a hunted man hiding at the edge of the world. They were the eyes of a man who had an appointment to keep, and a debt to collect, and every intention of walking back through his own front door to do it. She went back the way they had planned it beside the dying fire, in her mourning clothes, with her story pressed and ready, the dutiful housemaid returning from a family funeral down the coast. The gates opened for her without a second glance, because in that house grief was currently fashionable, and nobody wastes suspicion on the invisible. The estate had changed in 3 days. Vane's people stood at doors that had never needed standing at. Crates of documents moved through the halls like furniture in a divorce, and over it all hung the perfume of lilies and fresh printing, because the succession ceremony had swollen from a signing into a coronation. With the other families confirmed to attend within the week, Delaney tied on her apron and disappeared into her work, and her work carried her everywhere. That was the weapon no one in that house had ever understood. She polished her way into the small study behind the billiard room, where an auxiliary safe hid under a false vent panel, a hiding place she knew because dust does not respect secrets, and someone had to clean it. And from it she photographed the trust statements. Vane believed no eyes but his had seen. Accounts reshuffled in the exact pattern of the dead man's ledgers on the memory card, an old thief resuming an old habit at scale. She carried fresh coveralls to the garage and lingered over the service records long enough to capture the maintenance log for the armored car, its recent pages rewritten in a fresher ink, a fiction of inspections signed by a mechanic the older staff swore had never once set foot on the property. And from the little security annex where the housemaids collected lost keycards for return, she photographed the access registry, where one line glowed like a live wire, the driver's card, the dead man's card, recorded passing through the rear service gate on 2 separate nights, after the whole world watched divers search for his body. Everything Cassian needed was walking out of that house folded inside a laundry cart schedule, and she was one shift from finished when she felt the wind change. It came in the person of Sloane Fairbanks, the estate's counsel and keeper of its public face, a tall, composed woman with silver at her temples, and a gaze that weighed everything twice, a woman who had survived 20 years in that world by one skill above all others. She read which way the wind was leaning before the trees knew. Delaney passed her in the long gallery with her eyes properly lowered, and Fairbanks did not stop her, did not speak, only glanced once at the laundry cart and once at the hallway camera high in its corner, and walked on. By evening, Delaney understood what that glance had been. There was no arrest, no guards at her door, nothing so clumsy. Instead, a story began moving through the house and out into the city, the way stories moved in that world, by telephone, by barroom, by the mouths of men who owed favors. The story said the Thorn organization had found its leak. The story said a housemaid with gambling debts had been placed inside the estate by the Callahan family, that she had passed the master's travel routes to his enemies, that the bridge had been Callahan work built on a servant's whisper, and that the grieving house was quietly offering a finder's fee. Generous, no questions asked. For the woman herself, who had slipped away after the funeral she had helped arrange. It was beautiful, in the way a trap is beautiful. It gave the hunting families a traitor to hate. It explained the bridge without a whisper of Vane's name, and it turned every doorman, dockhand, and debt collector on the East Coast into eyes, looking for Delaney Mercer's face. She heard her own description read off a kitchen radio, while scrubbing a pot she never finished. And she understood that the walls she stood inside no longer belonged to a house. They belonged to a snare, and the snare was closing tonight. She left the cart, took only her coat and the phone sewn into its lining, and went out through the kitchen garden into the dark, and found the rear service gate standing between her and the world, its new lock answering to Vane's men alone. And then a shape detached itself from the gatehouse shadow, and her heart dropped through her shoes, because it was Buck Odell. The old man looked at her for a long moment in the dark. This cleaning girl the radio was calling a spy, and Delaney saw in his weathered face that he had heard every word of the story, and had spent the day measuring it against 30 years of reading liars, and against the memory of a girl with a rag full of red clay whom he had waved out of his office like a moth. He said nothing about any of that. He only produced his old master key, the one the new locks had somehow never been fitted to replace, turned it in the gate, and held the iron open just wide enough. "Go," he said quietly, "and tell him, if you find him, that not everyone in this house has forgotten whose name is on the gate." She squeezed his rough hand once, and slipped through into the service alley, and the gate clicked shut behind her, and she had taken exactly 4 steps toward the dark end of the lane when headlights she had not seen woke against the brick, and a long black car that had been waiting with its engine off rolled forward to block the alley mouth, and its rear door swung open. Her body braced to run before her mind finished the thought. And then a voice came low out of the car's dark interior, speaking the exact 5 words Cassian had made her memorize by the fire. The tide keeps what it loves. And the breath went out of her in a rush. His people, the quiet ones he had raised from the shadows of his father's generation, sent to bring her home the moment she cleared the walls. She climbed in, the door shut, and the car slid out of the alley with its lights low, threading the harbor back streets toward the marsh road. And Delaney was still learning how to breathe again when the driver of her rescue said one flat word, "Company," and the world tightened. A second vehicle sat angled across the narrow lane ahead, where the warehouses pinched the road to a single thread. Engine running, lights off, placed by someone who knew these streets, the way a chauffeur knows them. Their car stopped, and out of the blocking vehicle stepped a figure Delaney recognized before the streetlight ever touched his face. The build, the stance, the profile from 100 morning departures and 1 rain-smeared night at the end of a broken pier. The driver, he did not draw a weapon. He simply walked to their car and looked in through the glass at her. And Delaney, with her heart slamming, did the last thing anyone in that lane expected. She rolled the window down. Up close, the man commanding hunts across the marsh did not look like a devil. He looked like a man who had not slept since the bridge, gray in the cheeks, eyes rimmed red, a man being eaten from the inside at a steady rate. He said her name. He said she should step out, that there were people who wanted to speak with her, and his voice carried no appetite for any of it, only the exhaustion of a man reciting lines in a play he despised. And instead of pleading, instead of accusing, Delaney sat still and asked him one question. "How is your wife?" The night went very quiet. She had seen it in the access logs without understanding what she was seeing. His card passing the service gate on nights that made no sense. And she had seen it long before that without knowing, on the estate drives, the way he checked his phone at every red light like a man waiting on a lab result, because she had spent years of her own life checking a phone that same way. So she told him, softly, through the open window, the thing she had told only one other living soul beside a stove in a dead lighthouse, about a hospital and a mother, and a bill that no amount of scrubbing floors could outrun. And a morning she arrived after everything was already over. She watched the words land on him the way rain lands on a wall that has been waiting years to fall. The recitation went out of his face. The orders went out of his spine. He put one hand on the roof of the car to steady himself and said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, that his wife's kidneys had been failing for 3 years, that the treatments ran to numbers no working man would ever see, that the estate's insurance had found its reasons to stop, and that one evening, Preston Vane had appeared beside him in the garage with a checkbook and a single small request. Not a betrayal, Vane had called it, just a route, just a road. Nobody would be hurt. Arrangements had been made, and the first payment had already cleared before the man finished speaking, and by then, his wife had a treatment chair with her name on it. He had told himself it was a kidnapping for ransom. He had told himself the car was armored. He had been telling himself things every hour since the railing broke, and the telling had stopped working the night he stood on a pier firing wide on purpose into black water, praying to miss what he had been sent to find. Then the last of his architecture came down, and this man who had steered kings through the city laid his forehead against the roof of the car beside his own hand and shook, silently, the way men shake who have forgotten how anything else is done, and said that he was not sent tonight at all, that the hunt believed she was elsewhere, that he had watched the estate on his own because he could not stop himself, because he had needed to see her face, the face of the woman the radio was calling a spy, the only person in the whole poisoned world who had gone looking for the man he had helped to drown. Delaney reached through the open window and set her hand on his forearm, and she said to him the sentence that nobody in his world or hers ever said aloud. There is still a road back. He raised his head and looked at her, streetlight standing in his wet eyes. A drowning man sighting a shoreline he did not believe in. And he asked her, "If I speak, if I stand up and tell what I know, who keeps my wife alive?" When Delaney carried that question back to the lighthouse, along with everything her apron pockets had smuggled out of the great house, Cassian listened to all of it in silence, and then he asked for her phone. She had wondered, through every mile of that cold ride, why a man with an empire had waited so long to summon it. And he answered the wondering before she could speak it, as if he had heard it anyway. "It was never that I lacked people," he said, turning the phone over in his hand. "I lacked the thing that tells me which people were still mine. Now I have it. Vane's poison ran on salary," he said, "on the current payroll, on men whose loyalty renewed monthly like a subscription. So he would not call the payroll, he would call the debts. He dialed the first number from memory, a number never written anywhere, and when it answered, he spoke a name Delaney had never heard, an old word, half a joke, the kind of name men earn young and carry forever. And the voice on the other end went still and then said only, 'Tell me where and when.' A pawnbroker on the South Shore whose shop the elder Thorne had once saved from ruin. The second call reached a foreman who ran the night gangs on the coal piers, whose crews owed the family a debt older than their union cards. The third reached a woman who kept a waterfront bar and had once been carried out of a burning building by a Thorne, and she did not even wait for the question. 3 calls. No explanations offered, none requested, no money mentioned once. Delaney stood by the cold window, listening to a kind of power she had never imagined from the corners of rich men's rooms. Not the power that folds napkins and empties futures, but something older and stranger, gratitude with a long memory. And she understood that the true inheritance of the father was not the docks or the ledgers, but this. A handful of people scattered through the dark of the city, who would rise after decades of quiet for nothing but a name. By morning, the machine was moving, invisibly, gently. The driver's wife and children were collected from their row house by unremarkable people in an unremarkable van, and resettled, with her treatment schedule intact, in a clinic 2 states north under a name no ledger in Maryland had ever heard, guarded not by guns, but by the pawnbroker's watchful cousins. And word of it was carried back to the driver, along with a message from Cassian himself. 4 words only, "Your family is safe," which broke the man cleaner than any threat ever could have, and turned him, in a single night, from Vane's instrument into the state's willing witness. The state entered through the last door Delaney expected. Gideon Walsh was a retired federal man, with a limp and a garden, who had once, in another life, owed a debt of his own to the Thorne name, and when Cassian reached him through channels no active agency monitored, Walsh listened for a long time, and then made calls of his own to old colleagues who still carried badges. What came back changed the shape of everything. The Bureau, it turned out, had been circling Preston Vane for the better part of a year, pulled in by a pattern of transfers too clever by half, a financial trail that resembled, almost line for line, the pattern preserved on a dead man's memory card. They had the architecture of the crime. What they lacked was a living voice to stand it up in a courtroom, and now they were being offered 3, the heir himself, the driver who took the checkbook, and a housemaid with an apron full of photographs. But the negotiation that followed, relayed through Walsh across 2 tense days, was not gentle. Cassian's terms were simple. He would surrender the old ledgers entire, his father's and his own, knowing exactly what that surrender would cost the House of Thorne, and he would testify. The Bureau's terms were harder. Paper alone convicts accountants, they said. Conspiracies require the conspiracy assembled, and in 4 nights every principal, Vane, his bought men, and the visiting delegation of the Callahan family would be seated in one room around one document at the succession ceremony, and the arrests had to fall there, in the act, with the ink wet, or half the ring would scatter into their lawyers by dawn, which left one problem no badge could solve. Something would have to hold that room together, every man in his chair, every signature moving, while the net closed around the house, and there was exactly one thing on earth guaranteed to freeze that particular gathering in place: a dead king walking through the front door. Walsh brought the final plan to the lighthouse himself at dusk, and at the end of it, he looked at Cassian for a long moment, this pale, scarred man in a borrowed coat, and asked him quietly whether he fully understood what he was volunteering for, that he would be walking unarmed into a room, stocked with the private guns of the very man who had already killed him once. And Cassian said nothing at all. He stood by the window in the last of the light, and he fastened his cuff, first one, then the other. The unhurried ritual of a man dressing for a dinner he has every intention of finishing. Before they left the lighthouse for the last time, Cassian had turned to her in the doorway and offered her the only gift left in his possession, a way out. "You have done enough for 10 lifetimes, he said. "There is a car that can take you north tonight, away from all of it. and no debt follows you. And Delaney had looked at him in the dusk and answered that Preston Vane had built his whole kingdom on the belief that people like her were furniture, and that she intended to be standing in that room when he learned the cost of the belief. And Cassian had studied her for a moment, and then nodded once. Slowly, the way he nodded at things that were correct. So it was decided. And that was why, on the night of the succession, 2 shadows and not one moved through the service tunnels beneath the great house that a housemaid knew better than its owners ever had. Above them, the library blazed. The long table had been dressed like an altar. The heads of the coastal families sat in ranks with their seconds behind them. The Callahan delegation occupied the far side in watchful gray. Attorneys stood against the shelves like expensive furniture, and at the head of the table, in the chair whose previous occupant he had sent off a bridge, Preston Vane presided in flawless black, his glasses catching the lamplight, his voice pitched at the exact frequency of solemn duty, as the succession accord completed its journey around the table, gathering signatures like a plate gathering tithes. The document came to rest before him. The room quieted for the final act. Vane lifted the fountain pen, uncapped it without hurry, savoring the weight of the moment as other men savor wine, and lowered the nib toward the signature line, and the twin doors at the end of the library opened. There was no crash, no shout, just the ordinary sound of a handle turning, and then hinges, and then footsteps on parquet. Unhurried, slightly uneven, the gait of a man favoring one shoulder, and Cassian Thorne walked into the light of his own wake. The silence that followed had a texture Delaney would remember for the rest of her life, standing just inside the doorway at his back. It was not the absence of sound. It was sound dying in stages. A pen, somewhere, was set down on the table, with a click like a hammer being cocked. A chair eased back several inches, its legs dragging a low groan out of the floor. A glass stopped halfway to a mouth and returned to the wood without arriving anywhere. One of the Callahan men whispered something in a dead language that might have been a prayer, and nobody laughed at him. Grown men who had ordered funerals the way other men order breakfast sat pale and pinned, staring at the scarred, thin, upright figure crossing the room toward them, because every man present had attended enough deaths to know that this one had been certified, mourned, and divided. And here it came anyway, walking slowly down the length of the table, letting them look, letting the wound of it open in every mind. Cassian did not look at any of them. He looked only at the man in his chair, and Vane, to his credit, to the credit of whatever cold engine ran him, had not moved at all. Cassian stopped across the table from him, in easy reach of the accord with all its wet signatures, and he did not draw a weapon, did not raise his voice, did not touch the document. He simply extended his left hand backward into the air, an unhurried summons, and the room's stunned attention followed the gesture to the doorway, and Delaney Mercer walked forward. The housemaid, the spy of the radio broadcasts, the hunted woman with a price on her, crossing the library in her plain coat under the eyes of the most dangerous men on the coast, carrying a thick folder against her chest. She did not lower her eyes. She reached the table, and into the ringing silence, onto the polished wood directly in front of Preston Vane. She laid the folder down and opened it. Trust statements, a rewritten maintenance log, an access registry with one impossible line, and on top of it all, small and black and final, a 15-year-old memory card. And then she stepped back beside Cassian and stood, the invisible woman placing the evidence with her own 2 hands, exactly as Cassian had designed it, because the sentence had to begin this way, with the king's fall delivered by the person he had never once bothered to see. Then Cassian spoke, quietly, to the room. He named them, one after another, down the table, each man who had signed the accord, his voice level, without hatred, an accountant reading a ledger of souls, and after each name he offered the same 11 words. Stand away from the table now, and this night forgets your name. Chairs began, slowly, to move, and through all of it Preston Vane sat perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the defections with the mild expression of a man observing weather, and when the scraping stopped, he did the one thing nobody in the room expected. He smiled. He reached into his breast pocket, unhurried, and drew out not a weapon but a phone, woke its screen with his thumb, and turned it slowly around so that the light of it faced Cassian across the ruins of the accord. The screen held a photograph. Delaney, unmistakably, caught in lamplight beside a long black car in a narrow lane, the estate wall behind her, taken from close, taken from darkness, taken by someone she had never seen. "My people found your little ghost days ago," Vane said pleasantly into the silence, "and they have been at her shoulder ever since, which means they walked with her every step of the way, to wherever you have been sleeping, to whoever has been helping you, to every copy of every page in that folder. You forget where my people are standing tonight." And the room believed him. Delaney felt it happen around her like a change in pressure, felt the newly emptied chairs go still. "I felt even the federal timing waiting outside those windows suddenly weigh nothing against the simple arithmetic of a marksman already inside the walls. And for one long breath, the head of the table belonged to Preston Vane again." Then Delaney spoke. "Look closer at your photograph," she said, and her voice carried down the table clear and steady. "Ask yourself who stood near enough to take it, and why you have not heard from him since. The man you sent to shadow me drove me home that night. The picture in your hand is not surveillance. It is a resignation letter." She watched the meaning arrive behind the gold-rimmed glasses, watched Vane understand in a single cascading instant that the hunter he had bought with a checkbook had been the state's creature for days, that his eyes inside Cassian's camp were Cassian's eyes inside his own, that the ace he had saved for this exact moment had been played against him before he ever drew it, and for the first time in anyone's memory, Preston Vane's face forgot its arrangement. And into that wound stepped Sloane Fairbanks. The counsel rose from her chair along the wall, crossed the parquet with her heels sounding like a slow clock, and laid a small silver drive on the table beside Delaney's folder. "Every instruction you ever gave me in a room without paper, her voice even, her eyes on Vane, is on that drive, dated and preserved, because a careful lawyer insures against her own clients. I have served this family's chair for 20 years. I served the chair, not the man who climbed into it over its owner's body." The library came apart at the seams. Voices, chairs, men moving for doors, and in the churn of it, one of Vane's personal guards made the last loyal mistake of the evening, his hand coming up from under his jacket with dark metal in it, swinging toward the nearest target of his master's ruin, toward the housemaid standing exposed at the table's edge. And two things happened faster than thought. Cassian turned into the line of it, and an old gray shape, moving quicker than any man his age, had a right to came off the wall by the service door, and Buck Odell slammed into Delaney and took her to the floor beneath him, as the room cracked with a single shot that found the old man's shoulder instead of anything it was sent for. Then the doors and the windows gave way at once, and the house filled with blue jackets and shouted commands as Gideon Walsh's signal brought the bureau in on the sound of gunfire, agents flooding the library, weapons ending every argument. Vane's guard buried under 3 of them before he could choose another mistake. Delaney came up onto her knees with her ears ringing, and found Buck already sitting against the table leg, gray-faced and cursing softly, one hand clamped to his shoulder, very much and stubbornly alive, waving off the agent trying to ease him flat. And when she reached him, he looked at her from under his wild eyebrows and almost smiled. "Last time you came to me, I would not listen," he said. "Consider us square." Across the room, through the storm of arrests, Preston Vane had not run. He stood at the head of the table with his hands already rising for the cuffs, composed again, rebuilt in the space of seconds, and as the agents turned him, he looked down the length of the wreckage at Cassian and spoke his last free sentence with the calm of a man reviewing accounts. "Your father needed 15 years to see me coming," he said, "and you needed a housemaid. I built kingdoms out of being beneath notice. It is almost fitting that I was beaten by someone beneath mine." They started him toward the doors. And Cassian Thorne, who had not moved through any of it, crossed the floor then, slowly, and stopped in front of his father's killer, closer than the agents liked, and said nothing at all. And the whole ruined library went so quiet around those 2 men that every soul in it could hear, from the breast pocket of a borrowed coat, small and patient and terribly clear, the ticking of an old gold watch. Every man left in that library understood what was supposed to happen next, because they had all lived their lives under the old law of their world. The law that says a debt of blood is paid in the same currency, and the room held its breath, waiting for the Frost King to invoke it. The agents themselves seemed to feel it, pausing with Vane between them, sensing that something older than their warrants was being decided in the space between those 2 men. Vane felt it too. He straightened under the cuffs and lifted his chin, ready, almost welcoming, because a man like him had made his peace with that ending decades ago, had perhaps even counted on it. One clean moment of the old law and then legend, a story told in barrooms forever. And Cassian looked into the waiting face of the man who had taken his father, his house, his name, and 3 days of his dying, and he denied him all of it. "No," he said softly, reading the expectation and refusing it. "You would prefer the old way. It is quick, and it makes a myth of you. I am going to give you the new way instead. You are going to live, Preston. You are going to live a very long time in a very small room, and every morning of that long life, you are going to wake up and remember that everything you built, every year of patience, every purchased soul, all of it was undone by a woman you looked at 1,000 times and never once saw. That is your sentence. The law will keep you. The knowing will punish you." And then he stepped back and gave a small nod to the agents, a host releasing his guests, and they walked Preston Vane out of the library and down the great front steps in handcuffs, across the very marble he had stood upon days earlier, accepting condolences, past the staff gathered white-faced in the hall, and the last the House of Thorn ever saw of him was the back of his flawless black suit folding into a federal car in the blue wash of the lights. What followed in the weeks after cost Cassian more than the bridge had. He kept his word to Walsh and the Bureau down to the letter, and the letter was ruinous. The old ledgers went into evidence, his father's and his own, every page, and with them went whole provinces of the empire. The gray routes, the quiet arrangements, the accounts with 2 names, all of it surrendered, unwound, or signed away under supervision, and men who had grown rich in the family's shadow cursed his name for it. And he let them curse. He sat through depositions in borrowed conference rooms and answered questions no Thorn had ever answered. And when his own attorneys warned him what the honesty was costing by the hour, he replied that he had recently learned the price of the alternative, and it was 15 years of shaking hands with his father's killer. Delaney testified too, plainly, in her good coat, the housemaid whose photographs anchored the case, and when it was done, the interim counsel of the family, the frightened remnant of that long table, resolved to reward her, because their world understood no other response to debt. They summoned her to the library, the same room, cleaned now, and a silver-haired man began speaking of gratitude and of a figure commensurate with services rendered, and he was still unfolding his careful preamble when Delaney shook her head and stopped him mid-sentence. "I do not want your money," she said. There was no speech in her, no performance, only the flat certainty of a woman who had scrubbed that room's floors. "But there is one thing," she said. "Down in the harbor wards there are families drowning in hospital debt, decent people paying for the sin of getting sick, mothers rationing their own medicine, men working 3 jobs against a number that only grows. People like my mother was. Clear them. Every family in the Port District, every medical debt, quietly, no names attached, no cameras. Do that, and this house owes me nothing." The council stared at her. These men who had that very week watched an empire be signed away, and found themselves without a procedure for a person who refused to be bought. But it was Cassian, standing unnoticed by the tall windows through all of it, who moved first. He had listened to her wish with his face turned toward the dark glass, and he was silent for a long moment after she finished. So long that the room grew uneasy, and Delaney could not read what was working behind his stillness. Then he crossed to the desk without a word to anyone, lifted the telephone, and even though the hour had long since slipped past midnight, he called his attorney at home and told him to come to the house immediately and to bring the instruments for founding something new. The seasons turned, and the House of Thorn turned with them. What the lawyers began that midnight grew through the winter into something the East Coast had never seen from that name. Because Cassian did not stop at the surrenders the Bureau had required of him. He kept going, on his own, past the line where obligation ended, selling off the last gray corners of the old empire, retiring the arrangements his father's generation had thought eternal, and folding everything that remained into a single clean enterprise of docks and warehouses and honest freight, a company that paid its taxes and posted its wages and locked its doors on nothing. The families who had once feared him watched in bewilderment as the Frost King voluntarily melted his own kingdom down and recast it in daylight, and some called it weakness, and none of them said so to his face. And out of the recasting came the thing that mattered most, announced without ceremony in a 2-paragraph notice that never mentioned his name. A charitable trust registered quietly in the Port District, funded past any single lifetime, dedicated to lifting medical debt from working families, and to endowing scholarships in nursing for the sons and daughters of laboring households when they came of age for the trade schools and colleges. It was called the Mercer Foundation. Not Thorn. Mercer. Her mother's name, the name of a woman who had died waiting in a public ward, set now above every letter of forgiveness that went out unsigned into the harbor neighborhoods. And when Delaney had first seen the incorporation papers with that word printed at the top, she had needed to set them down and walk to the window for a while before she could speak. By the first true morning of spring, the Foundation's clinic stood finished on a corner lot where a condemned cannery had been, a low, bright building with clean glass and green paint, and the whole port district turned out for its opening. It was, Delaney thought, standing at the edge of it all, the finest morning that story had ever produced. Sunlight off the water, ribbon and bunting on the new fence, a little brass band from the longshoremen's hall playing slightly out of tune and nobody minding. And everywhere, the sound the old harbor had almost forgotten it owned. Children laughing, dozens of them, swarming the new playground the Foundation had built beside the clinic, chasing each other up the bright slides, trading balloons, comparing the crisp new backpacks the Trust had handed out for the coming school year, their voices rising over the rooftops like gulls, while their parents stood in loose, happy knots on the grass, holding letters that said "paid in full," and looking as though they had set down something enormously heavy and had not yet learned what to do with their hands. Through the crowd moved the quiet aftermath of the whole affair. Gathered in one place for the first time since the library, the driver was there, a free man since his testimony closed the case, working now as a dispatcher for the new clean company and learning to meet people's eyes again. His wife stood beside him in the spring sun, well and strong after her long treatment, her hand in his. Sloane Fairbanks had stayed on to draft the Foundation's charters, remarking to anyone who asked that the wind had finally settled in a direction worth standing in. And at the clinic's front gate, in a volunteer's vest he had absolutely refused to be paid for, his shoulder healed and his arm only lately out of its sling, stood Buck Odell, checking in visitors, teasing the little ones about their balloons, guarding this door the way he had guarded the great house's gates for 30 years, because, as he told Cassian plainly, a man his age should finish on a threshold worth standing at. Cassian himself stayed at the edges all morning, out of the speeches, out of the photographs, watching the crowd with an expression that the old world would never have recognized on him, and more than once, Delaney caught him following the sound of the children's laughter across the playground, the way a man follows music from a country he has never been allowed to visit. It was almost noon, with the band packing up and the balloons thinning into the blue, when he looked for her in the crowd and could not find her. She had slipped away without a word to anyone, through the gate past Buck, up the harbor road alone, carrying, someone said, a bundle of white flowers. The cemetery on the hill above the harbor was quiet in the early afternoon, the kind of quiet that holds room for one voice. Delaney walked the familiar gravel path between the modest stones to the one she knew by heart, knelt, and cleared the winter's last leaves from her mother's name with her bare hand, the way she always did. Then she opened her bag and took out not flowers but a small laminated card, new and bright, bearing her photograph and her name and the seal of the nursing college that had reinstated her that spring with a Mercer scholarship. She had tried her hardest to refuse and been overruled by the entire board. She set the student card gently against the base of the stone, where the sun could find it, and she stayed there on her knees for a while with her hand flat on the grass. "The day you left, I did not get there in time," she said at last, quietly, to the name in the granite. "But this time, Mama, this time I got there. I saved somebody." Her voice held almost to the end of it, and then did not, and she let it break, because there was no one on that hillside she needed to be strong for. Except that was not quite true. When she finally rose and turned, she saw him, far down the slope by the line of bare trees at the cemetery's edge. A tall, still figure in a dark coat holding a bundle of white flowers, making no move to approach, asking for nothing. Cassian had followed at a distance, and stopped at a distance. And as she watched, he looked up the hill toward the stone that bore the name his Foundation now carried, the woman who had raised, the woman who had saved his life, and he bowed his head to her, slowly and completely, a king's bow, given from far away to someone he had never met. And then he simply stood with his flowers, and waited for Delaney to decide whether to come down. She came down. The months that followed moved gently, the way time moves when it has stopped being an enemy, and the story finds its true ending on an ordinary weekday afternoon at the end of that first term, on the sidewalk outside the nursing college. In the flood of students released from the last lecture of the day, Delaney came through the doors with her books against her chest and her hair escaping its pin, older than her classmates and long past caring, and stopped because at the curb where the buses pulled in sat a plain black car with no driver standing beside it. No security detail bracketing the block. Nothing of the old armored world at all. Just a man alone behind the wheel, waiting, who had taught himself to drive that spring at his age, because he had decided there were places a man should arrive at as himself, and not as a procession. She crossed to the car and bent to the open window, and she could not keep the smile out of her voice. "Have you been waiting long?" she asked. And Cassian Thorne looked at her, this man who had once told her by a stove in a dead lighthouse that no one in his life had ever come near him without trembling, and answered, "I learned how. Some people are worth waiting for." She got in, and the plain black car pulled away into the ordinary traffic of the ordinary afternoon, and the harbor went on shining behind them. And perhaps that is the whole of it, in the end. The worth of a person was never written in where they stand, at the head of the table or kneeling at the floorboards, but in whether their eyes can still find another human being, when the whole world has agreed to look away, and kindness given freely, expecting nothing, keeping no ledger, remains the only force on this earth that can reach a heart everyone else had given up for frozen, and quietly bring it home. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its end. If it touched something in you, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the new stories we bring you every day. And tell us in the comments how this story made you feel. What moment stayed with you? Because we read every word, and we would truly love to hear what is in your heart. Until the next story, we wish you good health, peaceful days, and joy in every small thing. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.